Hello, my name is Joe Del Russo, and I'm a professor here at Montclair State University in the McCormick Center for Child Advocacy and Policy. I'm also a former Chief Assistant Prosecutor where I prosecuted crimes against children for over 20 years. And I have a small practice here in Clifton, New Jersey, where I advocate for clients who come in that have legal problems. This last module will focus on what professionals should do when they have a child they believe may have been sexually or physically abused. What kinds of things should you be mindful of, and what are some of the steps that you need to take to make sure that you get the highest quality information and the most information to share with the professionals who are going to address the issues. Professionals should be mindful of the fact that many children do not report abuse right away. They may delay telling about what happened to them for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they think they did something wrong. Sometimes the perpetrator might tell them they shouldn't tell someone. There are lots of reasons, and you should be mindful of the fact that how they tell and the amount of information they tell you is very personal. In fact, they may tell you in bits and pieces, and they may leave out parts that we may later learn. So it's up to you to pay close attention to what they say and how they say it, and not to judge them because they didn't tell everything right away. In fact, that's normal. That's what we expect. Many professionals are concerned about what exactly to do when they have a reasonable suspicion that a child may have been abused. Well, first of all, a professional should not judge the child or draw any conclusions or make any assumptions. You should provide support to the child. Let them know that it was correct for them to tell you what happened. Let them know that they're not in any trouble and that you're interested in what they have to say. If possible, you should attempt to write down the exact words that the child used that gave rise to a reasonable suspicion. Use the child's words, and we strongly encourage that you put exact quotes down in your notes so that others who read your notes, or even yourself, understands whose words were the child's and which words were yours. In communicating with a child about past abuse, it is important that you let the child express themselves in a developmentally appropriate way. What we mean by that is let the child say what happened in their own words. The child should do most of the talking. You should try to use what we call open-ended questions and say things like, "Tell me more about that," and "What happened next?" It's the child who's the source of information. You're there to provide comfort and reassurance. It is essential that when a professional has a reasonable suspicion of sexual or physical abuse upon a child, that you report that suspicion immediately. And immediately means exactly that, right now. Right now. So whenever you have a reasonable suspicion, make sure that you pick up the phone and call the numbers that we have provided throughout this video. Next, I want to talk about some things that you have to be careful about when you have a reasonable suspicion that a child may have been sexually or physically abused. Sometimes staff know the alleged perpetrator. It could be the child's uncle or father. It could even be another staff member. It is critical that you do not contact that person, that you do not share what you've learned with that person, or anybody who might contact that person and share information with them. Your primary obligation is to call the Department of Child Protection and Permanency immediately and ask them what to do next. They'll provide the kind of advice you need for handling the situation. The difficulty with telling the suspect or the person who is accused is they can engage in behaviors that are counterproductive and that might undermine the case. They could contact the caregiver, or they could flee the jurisdiction, or they could hurt the child or other people. So it is important that you not share that information until you get advice from professionals from the Division of Child Protection and Permanency or law enforcement. Professionals also need to be cautious about how the child perceives their behavior. That is, sometimes the professionals think that it's necessary to bring the child to some other person within the school or within the daycare center to repeat what they said. Sometimes teachers will bring the child to the school nurse or the school principal and ask the child to repeat what they've already disclosed. That's not a good idea, and we strongly discourage that. Do not usher the child throughout the institution or the school to have them repeat the disclosure. First of all, children have difficulty telling for the first time to you. To have them repeat it to others in the school can increase the trauma when it's unnecessary. And more importantly, many children believe that by having a professional ask them to repeat it to third parties, that they're not believed. And we want to show as much support as possible and let that child know that we're listening. There are a number of ways that children may get the message that they're not believed, and I want to share some of them with you. Professionals should exercise great caution when questioning the child and be careful not to communicate that they're judging them or disbelieving them in any way. For example, you may say to the child, "Are you sure?" Or, "I know Uncle, and he's a really good guy." Anytime that you demonstrate skepticism, the child can pick up on that. Often it's not what we say, but how we say it. So be careful not to communicate to the child that they're not believed. And the manner in which we address that child after they tell us can often lead that child to believe that there's skepticism about what they just reported. Many professionals are concerned that when they have a reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect upon a child, they need to gather all of the relevant information. That's simply not true. Once you have a reasonable suspicion, your obligation is to call the hotline. Even if you have partial information, the professionals from the Department of Child Protection and Permanency will give you guidance on what information is critical and what they need immediately. But do not delay reporting simply to get information that you think is important. Report immediately and communicate on the hotline with the screener, and they'll tell you what to do next. Another issue that professionals need to be mindful of: contacting the child's caregiver is something that happens naturally in daycares and in schools and institutions. It's what is expected to happen when there's an injury or a child has an issue at school. This is an exception to that. You do not contact the child's caregiver. You do not do that until you've spoken to the screener and to the DCP&P professionals after dialing up the hotline. And in part, the reason is these cases are all about abuse or neglect. And very often, the person who is the child's caregiver is the suspect. If they're not the abuser themselves, they may be complicit in the abuse. That is, they may have known about it and did not report it or facilitated it. So it's important that you not contact the caregiver until you've talked to the professionals who are trained to investigate these cases. Lastly, many professionals ask for guidance on how to talk to the child when they make that disclosure of abuse or neglect. What is important is that you let the child express themselves, that you encourage the child to explain what happened in their own words, and that you take a passive role and you listen, and as I said earlier, minimize those suggestive or leading questions. Ask open-ended questions like, "Tell me more about that," and "What happened next?" It is not your role to do an investigation. It is not your role to follow up. It is not your role to talk to other teachers or other personnel about what may have happened or whether they saw anything. That's exactly what not to do. Your job is to dial the hotline and they will give you guidance about what to do next. Your job is to get that information from the child and do a lot of listening. And once you get that information, you dial the hotline. And then the investigation will commence by people who are trained to do abuse and neglect investigations. So in sum, it is important that professionals do not investigate. It is important that professionals do not share the information they learn from the child about abuse and neglect with others. It is important that the professional dial the hotline immediately at 1-877-NJ-ABUSE. It is equally important that you not conduct your own independent investigation. And that can be simple things like talking to other witnesses, talking to other people in the school. Just call the hotline. You don't need to have all the facts. You don't have to be correct. You simply have to have a reasonable suspicion.